Thank you, guys. So this is part 2 of this thing we're calling the Old Testament from 30,000 feet. If you weren't here last week, here's kind of an overview. Why are we calling it the Bible or the Old Testament from 30,000 feet? By the way, the next semester is the New Testament from 30,000 feet. Why are we calling it this? I showed you a picture of this place. Shirley, by the way, thank you, Shirley. Shirley's filling in for Terry tonight. Thank you very much. What is this place right here? Y'all know? For hundreds and hundreds of years, that was the only view anybody had of it. And then somebody had the bright idea, let's get in a hot air balloon and go up above it. And then we get some pictures like this. And I don't have one, but if you scale and pull back even higher, you see mounds and rocks and roads and patterns just all over the landscape there. And in fact, scientists learned more about Stonehenge, who made it and what it was for, what they think it was for, by getting this aerial view than they ever did by having the face-on view. So what we're doing is taking the Old Testament and we're trying to get this big high-altitude picture and try to see the whole forest, not just the individual trees. Does that make sense? Trying to get a big, big picture. And the reason we're doing the Old Testament first might sound weird to some people because we live in an age where there's a lot of Christians and there's churches that teach, well, you don't mess with the Old Testament. Nobody cares about the Old Testament. You don't need to read the Old Testament. We live in the New Testament today, so don't bother with it. Well, I think that's foolish. I think it's really foolish to understand and then live in the blessing of the new covenant, the New Testament. You need to understand what the old one was all about because we have to have this new one because of the old one. So the Old Testament is really where we're going to get all of the foundational ideas of who God has revealed himself to be. So there's this great picture I showed this last week. This is a visual representation of all the times that the Bible cross-references itself, from Genesis to Revelation, through all the Old Testament to the New Testament. Each individual line there represents one time of the 63,779 times that the Old Testament is referenced in the New Testament. That's a lot. And so if it's referenced that much in the New Testament, we need to understand why. So that's why we're starting with the Old Testament. Plus, if you just start reading the Bible, you start in the Old Testament, right? Generally. So we got 7 weeks of this. Last week, we looked at creation, the fall, and the rise of humanity. I'll give you a review in just a second. Tonight, though, kind of going to get into the meat of what the Old Testament is all about, the start of the covenants with the patriarchs and the covenant promise. So let me give you a review of last week. We have Genesis 1 through 11. We saw creation, we saw the fall of man, we saw humanity on the rise. And Genesis 1 through 11 is the foundation for everything else in the Bible. You have to have a firm, faithful grip on what was God doing and saying in Genesis 1 through 11 so that you understand the rest of it. That's the foundation of the rest of the stuff that God has built. So it explains why the world the way it is, what sin did to the world, the remedy for sin. We get introduced to family and government and then God's people. What's most important though, and what we're going to really spend our time tonight looking at, and what we have to focus on in the Old Testament is the covenants. So there's 2 covenants in Genesis 1 through 11. A covenant is not a promise, it's not a commitment, and it's not a contract. Those are our words. Covenant is something much, much bigger, much, much more significant, and the consequences of breaking a covenant are severe. We're going to see it in a minute. But we get introduced to the idea of covenant, which is a conditional. There are always conditions. It's bilateral. That means there's 2 parties. And in the Old Testament, we're seeing this conditional bilateral agreement between God and the people he initiates the covenant with. Men don't initiate a covenant with God. God initiates a covenant with man. Does that make sense? And then there was always a signing, like we would sign a contract, but the signing of a covenant was always done in blood. And we're going to look specifically at how it was done. We're going to see it tonight as we go through it. In fact, the language when we read the English translation of the Old Testament, we'll see it tonight, that God made a covenant with this person. Made is our word. The Hebrew word is cut. So in Hebrew, when they would read the Old Testament, in their mind, they don't think God made a covenant. Their mind goes, God cut a covenant, because a covenant is cut, and you'll see why in just a second. Really interesting, the whole concept of covenant. Every culture had covenant practices, and the ones that we see in the Old Testament are consistent with what we see in Sumeria and in Anatolia and all these other places that all kind of had the same practices of covenant. So it was very consistent throughout the Old Testament. But in 1 through 11 of Genesis, we get introduced to two covenants. The first one is the Adamic covenant, the covenant between God and Adam. And Adam represents all of us, everybody who would come after him. Man had a role to play. Man's role in the covenant was to take care of, lord, rule, steward is the correct word, over everything that God made. God promised to bless them for obedience, but that there would be death for disobedience. And what did we choose? Death. We want to die. We're going to do it our way. So we have this problem right off the bat, page 1 of your Bible. But ultimately, what we see in the Adamic covenant is that God's role is to secure for all of humanity a final or ultimate solution or victory over sin and Satan. And here's the promise. One of the first promises in the Bible is Genesis 3:15. And God is talking to Adam and to Eve and to the one who deceived them. And he's laying out the consequences for everything that has happened because of their sin. And he talks to the deceiver, who we know him as Satan, the enemy. God is talking to this deceiver and says, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And then God says, her offspring will strike your head, and you will strike at his heel. And God is promising in Genesis chapter 3 that one of the offspring of the woman who rebelled, one of those offspring is going to mortally wound and destroy the deceiver. This is a promise and a prophecy, has yet to be fulfilled, right? We've talked about that in this class before, about when we look at the book of Revelation. This is a prophecy yet to be fulfilled, but a promise that God made. I'm going to take care of sin. This is my promise to you. First Adamic covenant. The second covenant we looked at last week was the Noahic covenant. It's between God and Noah and all living things. Noah represents all of us, all humanity. But this is a unique covenant because God didn't just make it with men. He made it with everything that was alive at the time. We'll look at it in just a second. Man had a role to play. Man's role was be fruitful and multiply, kind of like what God told Adam and Eve, and to steward what's new in God's consequential creation after the flood. Take care of it. God promises to never again destroy the earth by a global flood. God also guarantees Noah and his descendants that the world would now have a stable environment of seasons and cycles of weather and day and night. This is the first time we see this. We don't have that in Genesis 1 and 2. We see this, God providing this to all the descendants of Noah. And the sign of the covenant we looked at last week was the rainbow. Genesis 9:16, God speaking, when I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will remember the eternal covenant. Important word, eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth. This is the only covenant that God makes with somebody besides men. This is with all living things. And then God said to Noah, yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant I'm confirming with all the creatures on the earth. So that brings us up to today. That's Genesis 1 through 11. Tonight we're going to look at Genesis 12 through 50. And a group of guys called the patriarchs. I know it's kind of a bad word in our culture. I don't get it. The patriarchy, we're supposed to not like the patriarchy, but that's a bunch of, you know what it is. What would BC call that? Bull butter? Bull butter. I never know if I'm saying something bad when I say that, but I like it. The patriarchs and the covenant promise. This is the next level built on the foundation of the Old Testament. The first foundation is creation, the fall. The next level, the next set of bricks are these patriarchs. So let's look at them. Patriarch means father. It means those who come before us. These are foundational figures in the ongoing story of God's relationship with his special people. Now, traditionally, there are three. Do y'all know who they are? Don't show them yet, Shirley. Could you name the three traditional patriarchs off the top of your head? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. That's traditionally the three patriarchs that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism would tie into. I suggest five. I want to suggest to you that there are five patriarchs, okay? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Job. I'll explain as we go. You ready? Let's look at Job. Job, if you look at the language of the book of Job, if you look at the way mourning, the way families are constructed, just the whole logistics and the context of the culture in the book of Job indicates that this was probably the first book of the Bible written. It's probably the oldest book of the Bible, and that Job probably lived about the same time as Abraham. He was around at the time of Abraham. But God didn't make a covenant with Job, but God did something really special with Job. We had a whole 7-week series on the book of Job in here, so I'm not going to recount everything, but you get from Job this incredible understanding of the way God interacts with people that he loves, the way God interacts with humans. And the reason I say he's a patriarch is because Hebrew foundational thought when it comes to God is also based on Job and the way God and the devil and Job all interacted. It's part of their faith, and it should be part of ours, because Job is a foundation. If you understand Job, you have a foundational understanding of what God is doing in the lives of humans. There's 4 things when you learn from Job. That God doesn't spare his people from suffering. God said of Job, this is the most righteous man on earth. And yet he didn't spare him from suffering. That's an important thing to know, isn't it? Doesn't that give you hope that when you suffer, you're just like the most righteous man on earth, Job? That God is faithful even when life is out of control. That we can't understand the ways of God, but we can trust the ways of God. And that ultimately, God's activity on earth is grace and restoration. And so, although Job is not traditionally a patriarch, if a patriarch is a foundational figure in Old Testament thinking, Job is foundational to the thinking of everybody who reads the Old Testament. Does that make sense? It's not just in there by accident. He was alive when Abraham was alive. The things that God did in his life are important to the rest of the story. The rest of the story, we see God playing out in his people the lessons he taught Job. So that's, for me, Job is a patriarch. But then we get to the one everybody knows, and that's Abraham. Because Father Abraham had, and many sons had, y'all are good, that's very good. So we're going to start in Genesis 11 through 12. If you brought your analog Bibles, your own analog Bibles, you're free to look at your own analog Bibles. See the life of Abram, who is the son of Terah. And what we know for sure is that Abram, the son of Terah, was a sun worshiper, like the big yellow ball of fire in the sky. He was a sun worshiper in a place called Ur. The Bible calls it the land of Ur. We would call it Iraq today, same place. He was married to a barren woman, and the Bible points this out right at the beginning. He was married to a woman who could not give him children. And in Old Testament days, in ancient days, that's a big deal. If you weren't able to pass on your name, your bloodline, your story was over. And so the Bible points out right away that this wife of his, Sarai, could not have children. In Genesis 11 and 12, we see that out of nowhere, just like one day, God shows up in the land of Ur and speaks to a sun worshiper who has nothing to do with Yahweh, with Adonai. He just shows up one day in the life of Abraham. There's no reason, there's no explanation, there's no warning. God just shows up and calls Abraham. Out of everybody else who lived in Ur, he calls Abraham. We don't know why. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. This is from the Complete Jewish Bible because it gives you the names. So now Adonai, that's the name that we're using for God in the beginning of the Old Testament. Now Adonai said to Avram, his name was Avram at this point, little man. He's so dang cute. Here's what God said. Not, hi, I'm God. Nice to meet you. This was their first interaction. And God says to Avram, get yourself out of your country. Like, leave. Away from your kinsmen, your tribe, away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you are to be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but I will curse anyone who curses you. And by you, all the families on earth, all the families of the earth will be blessed because of you. So out of nowhere, Avram gets this call, and apparently without hesitation, without thinking, without weighing the cost, without talking to anybody, he just uproots his family and leaves his tribe, leaves his city, leaves his daddy's house, and sets off following this God that called him out of nowhere. Along the way, he settles in a land called Canaan, and his nephew, anybody know Abraham's nephew, what his name was? Lot. Abraham's nephew, his name was Lot, and Lot gets kidnapped, and it's a big problem, and Abraham raises an army, and when you read that, don't think, thousands and thousands of people, like 50 people is an army in this time. If you could raise a 100-person army, you were doing really good. So Abraham raises this little army, this little band of soldiers, and they go and they rescue nephew Lot. And on the way back, Abraham is walking by a place called Salem, and this strange priest named Melchizedek, who happens to represent Adonai, walks out and says, you need to pay a tenth on everything that all the spoils that you just took from rescuing your nephew Lot. And this is the first time we see a priest representing God, representing the God of the Old Testament, this strange person named Melchizedek. He's important in the Old Testament. So he does. He honors God with the spoils of war. And then over the years, Abraham accumulates great wealth. The Bible lists the stuff that he owns, the flocks and the camels and all these things. He is very, very wealthy. And because he has so much material possession, he is also very, very powerful. He has lots of slaves. He can raise a pretty good army in an instant. So he's a very powerful man. And into all of that, God now makes a covenant with Avram. He had promised him, if you do what I say, I'll bless you. But it wasn't a covenant yet. It was just a promise. So Abraham went on the promise, but now God initiates or cuts a covenant with Abraham. Genesis 15. So sometime later, this is after the rescue of Lot, the meeting of Melchizedek, gaining great power. The Lord spoke to Avram. By the way, Avram means exalted father. And later in the story, God changes the name from Avram to Avraham, which means father of many nations. Makes sense, doesn't it? God spoke to him in a vision and said to him, don't be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, Sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? How are you going to bless all my descendants if I don't have one? He's so honest with God. Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, who's a servant in my household, well, he will inherit all my wealth. This was just the structure of how inheritance worked without a son. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. I love how honest he is with God, that God can just handle this man's honest complaint. The Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own whom will be your heir. And really the language is, you and your wife will have a son, a legitimate son. That will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said, look up in the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you're going to have. And Abram believed the Lord, which is not a shock. Abram uprooted his family at the word of the Lord. Now Abram believes. And the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. And then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? The Lord told him, we're about to make a covenant. Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Strange shopping list. So Abram presented all these to God and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. You following? This is how covenant is cut. If you cut a covenant, you take these animals and you cut them in half and you lay them side by side and you create a walkway in between. Following? However, he didn't cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep. Terrifying darkness came down over him, and the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years, but I will punish that nation that enslaves them. And in the end, they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. In other words, when they come back, they're coming back to punish these pagans. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, which sounds weird to us, but they're symbols of the presence of God to the people reading this. He saw the presence of God pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord cut a covenant with Abraham that day. The reason you would do that, the reason that you as the cutter of the covenant, the initiator of the covenant, would walk through the carcasses is you are saying, here are my conditions. Here's what I promise to do with you. I'm making a covenant. I will make you a great nation. I will take care of you. I will give you this land. If I don't, I will be like one of these dead animals that I'm walking through. This is how covenants were made. We sign a piece of paper saying, yeah, you can take me to jail. They were saying, no, if I don't keep my word, I'll just be a dead man like these animals are dead. Just cut me in half. So this is what God was saying to this man. I've given this land to your descendants, by the way, not to you. This land isn't yours, Abraham, but I've given it to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River, a land now occupied by all the ites, and you can read them for yourself. So here's the Abrahamic covenant. It's between God and Abraham, but then all of the descendants of Abraham, okay? It's unconditional. Abraham didn't have to do anything. Isn't that interesting? Adam and Noah had a role to play. Abraham just had to receive it. So it's an eternal, unconditional promise from God, covenant from God to Abraham and all of Abraham's descendants. He promises to give him descendants, his descendants, the land of Canaan. He promises to bless all people on earth through Abraham's descendants. This is also a prophecy, not just a promise. God's redemptive plan for sin is launched in the promise, the covenant to Abraham. The promise in Genesis 3 that one of the offspring of Eve will ultimately be the answer for sin, that whole thing starts to take off right here in Genesis chapter 11 and 12. And the sign of the covenant is circumcision. Noah gets a rainbow, Abraham gets a knife. It is messed up. It is not right. Abraham, however, he just can't wait. And he feels like it's impossible. How is God going to keep his promise when I'm married to a woman who can't have kids? And technically, his wife makes this suggestion. Why don't you just have sex with my servant, Hagar, and then that can be the child of the promise. That'll be the child that God blesses. Now, technically, it was her idea, but Abraham's the one that did the deed. Are you following me? So Abraham is at fault here, not Sarah. He sleeps with Hagar, and an illegitimate son is born, and his name is Ishmael. Ishmael means God will hear you. And Hagar. And Abraham's wife then, not long after that, well, she gets pregnant. Golly, God kept his promise. And she has a son, and his name is Isaac, and Isaac means, honey, do you know what Isaac means? We're going to name Josiah Isaac because of his laughter. So now we have Sarah and her son Isaac, and Sarah's servant and the illegitimate son of Abraham, Ishmael, living in the same little tribe, the same little area. And as you would suspect, that's a problem. And Sarah doesn't like this. And so Sarah convinces Abraham to, quote, send her and him away. Now, that sounds benign enough, innocent enough, but to be sent away meant cut off. And to be an Egyptian slave that was sold to this wife of Abraham, to be cut off means she is very vulnerable. She is more vulnerable than we would understand. She has nobody to protect her, nobody to care for her, no way to make money, no way to provide for herself. She is literally sent off to the desert to die. That's what this is implying. She is sent away to die so that the problem can just die with her. But she cries out to God. And God promises to care for her and promises Hagar, I will make a great nation out of your son because your son is Abraham's son. And I promised Abraham all his descendants would be blessed. So I will continue to bless your son. Around this time, not long after that, God instructs Abraham to take his son, and the language, we're not going to look at it, the language God uses is, take your son, your one and only son, the son you love, and take him and sacrifice him. This is the first time in Scripture that the word love is used. And what's cool is, the first time the word love is used, it is used in the context of a man who is asked to give his one and only son as a sacrifice. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Like John 3:16? It's foreshadowed here in the life of Abraham and Isaac. Isaac is old enough to understand what's going on. He's not a child. He's probably a teenager. Abraham obeys, takes Isaac up Mount Moriah, and is about to plunge the knife in the poor kid's chest. And at the last minute, God provides a substitute. There's a ram stuck in the thistle next to him. And so Abraham doesn't have to sacrifice his son, although he was willing. And then ultimately Abraham dies, and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, live in constant conflict, the scripture tells us. Genesis 25. Abraham lived for 175 years, and he died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. He breathed his last and joined his ancestors in death. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the fields. You can see all that. This was the field that Abraham bought when he first got there. And then the Bible continues in Genesis 25, and it tells us what happened to Ishmael. He didn't just go off and die, and God didn't just forget about him. This is the account of the family of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, through Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant. He lived for 137 years. He breathed his last, joined his ancestors in death. Ishmael's descendants occupied the region of Havilah to Shur, which is kind of down south of the Negev, which is east of Egypt in the direction of Asher. And then the Bible tells us this. His descendants, there they lived in open hostility toward all their relatives. Does this sound familiar? Seen the news? This is still happening. This is why this is still happening. Because somebody couldn't wait for God to keep his promise, took things under his own control, tried to give God his own solution. I'll take care of this for you, God. Wasn't willing to wait and created this illegitimate son that we're still seeing strife and conflict because of this decision today. So that's Abraham. Let's look at Isaac, the next one in line to receive the promise from God. You see his story, Genesis 21-35. He's the first son of the covenant, but he is not Abraham's first son, right? He's Abraham's second son. But he's the first son of the covenant because the covenant was for his legitimate sons, not for his illegitimate sons. And I just find it interesting that Isaac, there really wasn't anything significant, big, profound about his life other than he lived his life knowing I'm alive because God provided a substitute for me. Think about being a young man. Here's what happened. Genesis 22. Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders. So Isaac was big enough and old enough. Come on in, guys. He was big enough and old enough to carry firewood on his shoulders like a backpack. And he's old enough to understand what's happening. While he himself, Abraham, carried the fire and the knife, as the two of them walked together, Isaac turned to his dad and said, "Father," "Yes, son?" "We have fire and wood," the boy said, "but where's the sheep? What are we sacrificing here?" "Well, God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son," Abram answered, and they both walked on together. And ultimately, this kid, this young man, he allows his father to bind him to an altar. And he's laying there on this altar as his dad pulls out the knife, and he realizes, okay, I'm the sacrifice. He doesn't fight. He doesn't resist. He's ready to accept this. But God provides this substitute for him, and then this guy gets to live the rest of his life knowing, I'm alive because God stepped in at the last moment. Not only did he spare me, but he provided a substitute sacrifice. And this is really the theme of Isaac's life, is that he's alive because God provided a substitute. He meets and marries a woman named Rebecca, and Rebecca has a really difficult pregnancy, and she cries out to God about this pregnancy, and God literally says to Rebecca, the reason your pregnancy is so difficult is there are two nations at war within your womb. Well, that's not very encouraging, but that's what God says to this poor woman. There's two nations at war within you. She has two sons. She has twins. Esau, which means hairy, and Jacob, which means heel grabber. We'll talk about them in just a second. Isaac goes on. He lives a quiet, consistent, ordinary, mostly faithful life. He makes some of the same mistakes that his father made, but for the most part, Isaac's life is very simple. He's just an obedient, ordinary guy, going about his business, taking care of the family, taking care of the sheep, doing what men do, and he dies. Then we meet his son. We met him when he was born. He was one of the two nations at war within his wife. His name is Jacob, Yaakov. You see his story in Genesis 25 through 50. As an older kid, probably a young man, he tricks his brother out of his birthright. Now, a birthright meant if you're the firstborn child, you get double the inheritance. If you're the firstborn son. So if dad has $1,000 to be an inheritance, if you're the firstborn son, you get twice as much as whoever's left. Does that make sense? So if they're splitting it in two, you get twice as much as your little brother. That's the birthright. Well, Jacob wants that. And one day his brother Esau has been out hunting and he's tired and he's starving to death. And so Jacob cooks him a pot of chili stew and says, hey, you sell me your birthright, I'll give you something to eat. And his dumb brother says, okay. And he does it. And he trades his birthright for a bowl of soup. Stupid. Later, as his father is dying, as Isaac is dying, Jacob, with the leadership of his mom, deceives his dad, puts on goat skin, so he's super hairy, so he smells like the field. His dad's kind of maybe senile, certainly blind at this time, and goes in and says, hey, it's me, Esau, I'm ready for the blessing. Now, as an old man was dying, he would place his hands on his children and give them a blessing. Not speak nice words, but speak a prophetic word. Here's what's going to happen in your life. And so Jacob tricks his father into thinking that he's Esau, the firstborn, and so Isaac gives Jacob Esau's blessing, the blessing of the firstborn. Does that make sense? So this is what we know right off the bat about this man is that he's a deceiver, he's a trickster, and he's taking stuff that's not his. However, God continues the covenant through this man. He receives the birthright and the blessing of the firstborn. He lives a life, as you can imagine, marked by constant striving. He was born striving, holding on to the heel of his brother. That's what his name means, heel grabber. When he was born, he was holding on to the ankle, the heel of his brother. And he lived his life like that for the rest of his life. He lives in conflict, and the family story of Jacob and just read it. It's full of dysfunction. It's such a dysfunctional family. One day, God changes his name to Israel. See, he realizes that his brother, he gets word that his brother is coming to meet him. And there's been a big family conflict. And in Jacob's mind, brother Esau is coming to kill me. And so he sends all of his family away, and he decides to meet his brother alone. And he spends the night by the river, and this, quote, man shows up. And Jacob and this man, we later find out the man is God. They wrestle all night long because Jacob refuses to let go of the man because he's a constant striver. He's a heel grabber. He refuses to let go of the man once he realizes it's God until God blesses him. And God says, I have had enough of you, and paralyzes him in the hip. And then God says, you are no longer Jacob. Your name is Israel. Anybody know what the name Israel means? Wrestles with God. How appropriate is that on two levels? One, this guy I just named wrestles with God. I just spent a whole night wrestling with him. But is that not the characteristic of the nation of Israel from this point on? They have always wrestled with God. God says, do this, and they wrestle with it. God says, don't do that, and they wrestle with it. They're always contending with God. This was foreshadowing. This was a prophetic word, not only over this man, but over all of his descendants, that they would be wrestling with him forever. Jacob, he has 12 sons, right? He has 2 wives, and the story of how he gets tricked. He gets tricked by his uncle Laban, and he has to end up working 14 years to marry the woman he wants to marry. He sees this woman named Leah, and he wants to marry her, and he makes this deal with her dad. He says, yeah, work for me for 7 years, and then you can have her. I know that sounds very strange to us, but he did. And then on the marriage night, Laban tricks him and gives him his oldest daughter, and he's not too happy about that. So he makes another deal, and now you can have 2 wives. And so after 14 years, he gets the woman he wants and the woman he didn't. So he has some children with both of them, and then he also has some children with 2 of their concubines, their servants. So this man has 12 children. This is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the 12 guys that started the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is his favorite because he's the youngest of the woman that he loves. And Jacob, being a brilliant father, makes sure that the rest of the boys know Joseph's my favorite, and gives him this special coat that just basically screams, kill me, because I'm dad's favorite. And that's exactly what happens. They're out taking care of sheep one night, and the rest of the brothers have had it with this guy. He's a dreamer. He's always talking about all of his dreams, and everything's going to be so great. And we're like, done with you. And so they throw him in a pit. They tear his coat up. They see a band of slave traders on the horizon. They sell him to the slave traders. They lie to their dad and say, I guess some bear got him or something. Here's his coat. Here's your stupid coat back, Dad. And it's all bloody. And so Joseph gets carted off. He's taken away from home, and he's sold as a slave into an Egyptian household. And what's amazing about Joseph is that he acts with complete and total integrity. And in fact, everything he does just has the hand of God on it. He is blessed. He has the favor of God on his life. He's falsely accused and gets thrown in jail. While he's in jail, he displays these great gifts. And some people in jail are very powerful men, and they get taken back to the emperor, to Pharaoh, and they forget about Joseph. So he's been sold, he's been betrayed, he's been lied about, he's been thrown in jail, and then he's been forgotten. And one day, Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, starts having weird dreams, and some guys that used to be in jail with this kid named Joseph go, there's a guy in jail who knows how to interpret dreams. You should talk to him. And so Joseph talks to Pharaoh and interprets the dreams, and they develop this relationship. And ultimately, this man, this favorite son of Jacob, of Israel, he gets exalted, elevated, and now he's the second in command of Egypt. It goes Pharaoh, Joseph, everybody else. This is unprecedented. This does not happen. This is a foreigner with nothing to his name, no family to speak of, he has nothing. He's an inmate. And he gets elevated to second in command of Egypt, and he lives with great integrity. And because of his incredible leadership and wisdom, he saves Egypt, and not just Egypt, but many of the surrounding nations around Egypt from one of the most severe famines the world has ever seen, a 7-year famine. Because of Joseph's wisdom, he saves them. His leadership is just proven invaluable in this season. And one day, because his brothers are starving, they show up to Egypt and are begging for some food. And Joseph hears their voices, and that's my brothers. And he actually stands before them. And he's dressed like an Egyptian now, and he speaks the Egyptian language, and the guys don't recognize him. Can you imagine? They didn't even recognize their little brother that they sold as a slave a few years ago. Through some crazy events, they have to come back, and they're all standing before their brother, and he reveals himself to them. It's me, dummies. It's me. I'm the one you sold as a slave. And the Bible tells us they're terrified because he could have them put to death on the spot. But one of the most telling and just profound verses in the Old Testament is Genesis 50:20. He says to his brothers, "You meant to hurt me, but God turned your evil into good." God turned your evil into good to save the lives of many people, which is being done. How many people through the generations have been just bolstered by this verse, that God takes what evil people meant for evil and he turns it good? That's the story, isn't it? I mean, some of you, that's your story, that what happened to me was evil, but God turned it good. This is what God has been doing. And we're to understand this from the life of the patriarchs, that all these crazy, weird things happen, and yet God takes all those things that were even meant for evil, and he turns them good. So ultimately, there's a restoration, and Joseph moves his Hebrew family from the land of Canaan to Egypt to protect them, and something crazy happens. And it's historically proven outside of the Bible. All this stuff can be proven outside of the Bible. We've talked about this a little bit. But his descendants multiply and gain incredible power and influence. And what we see historically is, especially in the Egyptian records, that there was this period of time when an Egyptian didn't sit on the throne of Egypt for a couple hundred years. In fact, this group of people called the Habiru, who were not Egyptian, who moved in from the West, they came and just basically, they had so many kids and so much power and so much influence that we couldn't stop them. And the people that sat on our throne weren't Egyptian for hundreds of years. And this was the descendants of Joseph, God's people getting favor in the land of Egypt. But this wasn't the land that God promised them, right? God promised them something else. And so we get to the end of the life of Joseph, and we'll see it next week, but we're going to jump into the book of Exodus because the book of Genesis ends on such a happy note that all these things worked out so good, and Joseph saved everybody, and now his family's reunited, and they're all living together in the land of Goshen, and man, everything's great. And then Exodus chapter 1 starts. Let's look at it because it's going to set us up for next week. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. A new king began to rule Egypt who did not know who Joseph was. So much time had passed that the current leader of Egypt, the new Pharaoh, didn't even know Joseph, never heard his name. And this king said to his people, look, these people of Israel, there are way too many and they're too strong for us to handle if we don't make plans against them. This is the first time we see in history of many of a nation making plans against God's people. We've seen this, right? We've fought wars over this. There are periods of history where a government decides that group of people has to die. We have to exterminate those people. Are you following me? This is the first time we see it. He said they're too much for us to handle. If we don't make plans against them, the number of their people will grow even more. And then if there's a war, they may join our enemies and fight us and escape from the country. So the Egyptians made life hard for the Israelites. They put slave masters over them who forced the Israelites to build these great cities as supply centers for the king. But the harder the Egyptians forced the Israelites to work, the more the Israelites grew in number and spread out. And so the Egyptians became very afraid of them. So you have this huge slave labor force living in the borders of your country that outnumber you vastly. And if they ever get wind that they could do something, they could take you in a heartbeat. And so the Egyptians just start making slaves of them, making their life super, super hard. And so next week, that leads us right into the third big building block of the Old Testament that we have to get a big bird's eye view of, the Exodus, leaving Egypt. And then God establishes law for his special people. And in this law, we see why we need a Savior. Okay? So next week, we're going to look at the Exodus, and we're going to look at the law and why it screams, you can't do this by yourself. You need my help. You need a Savior. That's the whole point of the law. Okay? I'm out of breath. Any questions? Yes. 100%. The root of that is back in the promise that God made to Abraham. When God said to Abraham, of your descendants, all people who bless you will get blessed, but all people who curse you will be cursed. But here in this book of Exodus, we see that for the first time that as a whole, they're not called Jews yet. The Hebrew people are targeted just because they're God's people. This is the first time, and it's not the last time. And World War II wasn't the last time, and what's going on today isn't the last time. It's going to keep happening because they're God's special people. And the enemies, the deceiver, our enemy, doesn't want God's special people to enjoy God's special blessing. And it's always going to happen until God sets it right. Other questions? There's no silly, well, there are silly questions, but I doubt you would ask one. %. Absolutely. Absolutely. You can go see it. Yeah. The place where Abraham went to rescue Lot, you can stand on the steps that Abraham had to walk up to get into the city of Dan to rescue Lot. You can still go there and still see it. It's amazing. Yeah. I'll show you a picture if you want to see one. All right, let's pray. Call it a night.